What if love didn't begin with romance, but with survival? A woman who lost everything. A man who stopped living long before he stopped breathing. And two children who unknowingly brought them together. No promises, no fairy tales. Just cold mornings, hard work, and wounds that never truly healed. But somewhere between fixing fences and saving lives in a storm, something begins to grow. Not fast, not easy, but real. Stay with me. Because this is not just a love story. It's a story about learning how to live again. This story teaches us that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past. It comes from building something new despite it. Love isn't about perfection. It's about standing beside someone when life is at its hardest. This channel is dedicated to stories of the Wild West. Cowboy life, quiet love, family bonds, compassion, and the deep human connections that hold people together through hardship. If you felt something while listening, leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe. Because more stories like this are waiting for you.
The engine didn't die with a dramatic bang, but with a pathetic wheezing cough that sounded entirely too much like her late husband's final days. Clara slammed the heel of her hand against the steering wheel of the 1984 Ford. The worn vinyl cracked under the impact, a familiar sting against her calluses. Beside her on the torn bench seat, Barnaby, a sheepdog who had more gray in his muzzle than black, whined softly and rested a heavy chin on her thigh. "I know, old man," Clara muttered, her voice rough from the dry dust of the trail. "I know." She killed the ignition, cutting off the sickly sputter of the engine. The sudden silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the howling of the autumn wind sweeping down from the jagged peaks. The biting cold seeped through the floorboards almost instantly. Clara didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she hadn't been able to afford for 3 years. Instead, she grabbed her worn canvas jacket, checked the chamber of the Winchester rifle she kept behind the seat, and pushed the rusted door open. Popping the hood released a cloud of acrid black smoke that smelled of burnt oil and defeated machinery. The radiator was blown, again. She stood on the dirt road assessing her options. She had a quarter tank of gas, $32 in her pocket, and a dog that was too arthritic to walk the 10 miles to the nearest town. Through the breaks in the pine trees, about a mile down a rutted side path, she saw the weathered gray roof of a barn. "Stay here, Barnaby," Clara ordered, tossing her jacket over the dog to keep him warm. "Guard the house." The walk to the property was grueling. The wind felt like needles against her cheeks, and her boots, resoled twice already, crunched loudly against the frozen gravel. She was halfway up the property line near a steep rocky outcrop when she heard it. A high-pitched shriek, quickly stifled, followed by the frantic scrambling of small boots on loose shale. Clara dropped her posture instinctively, her hand drifting toward the heavy hunting knife at her belt. She moved silently toward the rocks. Peering over a weathered boulder, she spotted them. 2 little girls, no older than 7, backed against a sheer wall of granite. They were a matching pair of tangled, dark hair, mud-stained overalls, and scraped knees. And less than 3 feet in front of them, coiled tightly in the dry brush, was a timber rattlesnake. Its tail was a blur, sending a dry, terrifying hiss into the cold air. The girls were frozen, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. The snake was agitated, its diamond-shaped head pulling back to strike. Clara didn't shout. Shouting got people killed. She moved with a fluid, terrifying efficiency, born from years of surviving a land that didn't care if you lived or died. She picked up a thick, heavy branch of deadwood. Stepping out from the boulder, she positioned herself between the girls and the snake. "Don't move a muscle, little birds," Clara said, her voice a low, steady rumble. With a swift, practiced motion, she brought the heavy branch down, pinning the snake just below its head. The body whipped frantically, thick and muscular, wrapping around the wood. Clara didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her heavy boot coming down hard and decisive. When it was over, she kicked the carcass into the deep brush, wiped her boot on the dry grass, and turned to the girls. They were staring at her, eyes wide as saucers. They weren't crying. Instead, they looked at her with a raw, unblinking fascination. "You're supposed to be indoors," Clara said gruffly, sheathing her knife. "Wind's picking up." "I'm Maisie," the one on the left said, her voice a raspy whisper. "That's Lily. You killed it." "It was in the way," Clara replied simply, dusting off her jeans. "Where's your house?" Lily pointed a dirty finger toward the gray barn in the distance. Without another word, both girls stepped forward and grabbed Clara's hands. Their small fingers were freezing, sticky with pine sap, and completely trusting. Clara stiffened. She wasn't used to being touched. She tried to gently pull away, but the twins held on with the grip of a vice, dragging her down the dirt path toward the homestead. The Hayes ranch had seen better days. The fences were sagging, the paint on the main house was peeling, and the smell of neglected chores hung in the air. By the barn, a man was wrestling with the rusted axle of a John Deere tractor. He was covered in grease, his flannel shirt torn at the shoulder, and his broad back tense with exhaustion. "Dad!" Maisie yelled, her voice echoing across the empty yard. The man dropped his wrench with a loud clatter and spun around. The sheer panic in his eyes morphed into confusion as he took in the sight. His two feral daughters, safe and sound, clinging to the hands of a strange, dust-covered woman with a hardened jaw and eyes as gray as the winter sky. Arthur Hayes wiped a greasy hand across his forehead, leaving a dark smear. "Maisie, Lily, what did I tell you about wandering off past the ridge?" His voice was gravelly, steeped in an exhaustion so deep it resonated in his bones. He finally looked at Clara, his guard instantly coming up. "Who are you?" Before Clara could introduce herself, Lily stepped forward, puffing out her small chest. "Dad," she declared, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. "We found a wife for you. She kills snakes and doesn't scream. We're keeping her." Arthur choked on his own breath, a dark flush creeping up his neck beneath the grease. He stared at his daughters, then at Clara, utterly mortified. "Lily, what in God's name—" Clara didn't blush. She didn't giggle or look away shyly. She looked Arthur dead in the eye, seeing the dark circles under his eyes, the fraying cuffs of his shirt, and the desperate disarray of his homestead. She recognized the look of a man drowning because she saw it in the mirror every morning. "My truck blew a radiator a mile up the road," Clara cut in, her tone flat and businesslike, completely ignoring the girl's outrageous declaration. "I have a dog in the cab who's going to freeze if the sun goes down. I don't want your money, and I definitely don't want a husband." Arthur blinked, taken aback by her bluntness. I don't have a spare radiator." "I know how to rebuild one," Clara said. "But I need a warm bay, a welding torch, and parts. I can see you're short-handed here. The fence line is rotting, the horses need shoeing, and your girls are running wild enough to get cornered by rattlers." Arthur flinched at the mention of the snake, his eyes darting to his daughters in alarm. "I'm a hard worker," Clara continued, not giving him time to argue. "I'll cook, I'll clean, and I'll keep these two from getting themselves killed. In exchange, you tow my truck into your barn, let me use your tools, and give me a roof over my head until the first snow melts. A straight trade, labor for shelter." Arthur stared at her. The wind howled around them, kicking up dust that settled on their boots. He looked at his daughters, who were both nodding furiously, still clutching Clara's coat. He looked back at Clara, at her squared shoulders, her unyielding gaze, and the calluses on her hands that told him she wasn't bluffing about the hard work. He rubbed his jaw, letting out a long, defeated sigh that turned into a cloud of white breath. "I'll go get the tow chain," Arthur mumbled, turning back to the tractor. "But if you burn my kitchen down, the deal is off." The tow back to the Hayes homestead was a slow, agonizing crawl. Arthur drove the rusted John Deere, the heavy logging chain pulling taut with a metallic groan, while Clara sat in the freezing cab of her Ford, wrestling with the stiff, unpowered steering wheel. The wind had picked up, howling through the cracks in the weather stripping, carrying the bitter promise of an early winter. Barnaby lay curled on the passenger seat, a shivering mass of gray fur, his breathing shallow. When they finally rolled to a stop inside the cavernous, drafty barn, the sudden absence of the wind was a physical relief. Clara climbed out, her legs stiff from the cold. She opened the passenger door and gently lifted Barnaby. The dog was too heavy for her. 60 pounds of dead weight and aching joints, but she hoisted him over her shoulder without a grunt of complaint. Arthur stood by the tractor, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag. He watched her carry the dog, his jaw tightening. He was a man accustomed to carrying burdens alone, and seeing this slight, dust-covered woman doing the same struck a discordant note in him. "You can put him by the stove in the kitchen," Arthur said, his voice gruff, lacking any real hospitality. It was an instruction, not an invitation. Clara nodded once. "Appreciate it." The main house was a sprawling, two-story structure of weathered cedar siding that had likely been beautiful a decade ago. Now, it looked tired. The front porch steps groaned under Clara's boots. When Arthur pushed the heavy oak door open, the smell hit her first: stale coffee, wood smoke, and the distinct, dusty odor of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. The kitchen was a disaster. Piles of unopened mail covered one end of the large oak table. The sink was a mountain range of unwashed cast-iron skillets and ceramic plates. A layer of grime coated the stovetop, and a child's forgotten sweater lay crumpled on the floor. It wasn't a house born of laziness. Clara recognized it instantly. It was a house paralyzed by grief. It looked exactly like her own trailer had looked in the first 6 months after John died. Arthur cleared his throat, a dark flush creeping up his neck. He stepped past her, hastily grabbing a pile of dirty shirts from a chair. "I ain't had much time for housekeeping. The herd takes most of the daylight." "I didn't ask for an apology," Clara said flatly. She laid Barnaby down on a faded braided rug near the cast-iron wood stove. The iron was barely warm. She didn't wait for permission. She found the wood box, grabbed 2 split logs, and stoked the dying embers, coaxing a flame to life. "Show me where the soap is, and the steel wool." "You don't have to do that tonight," Arthur protested, his pride stung. "You've been stranded all day." "A deal's a deal, Hayes," Clara replied, shedding her heavy canvas jacket. Underneath, she wore a faded flannel shirt tucked into denim. She didn't look at him as she rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and a smattering of faded scars. "Water won't boil itself." For the next 3 hours, Clara didn't stop. Arthur retreated to the barn to finish the tractor axle, leaving her to her domain. Maisie and Lily, entirely unbothered by the sudden introduction of a stranger into their home, sat at the cleared end of the kitchen table, drawing on scrap paper and watching her with owl-like fascination. Clara didn't coddle them. When Lily asked if Clara was going to be their new mommy, as she had declared to her father, Clara scrubbed a burnt pan with punishing force and said, "I'm a mechanic, kid, not a mother. Now take these plates to the cupboard." Surprisingly, the girl obeyed without a whine. Dinner was a silent affair. Clara had salvaged enough edible ingredients from the disorganized pantry to make a thick venison stew and a pan of rough cornbread. They ate by the dim light of the overhead bulb. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid. He ate mechanically, staring at his bowl. He hadn't tasted a hot, home-cooked meal in 2 years that hadn't come out of a tin can. The stew was rich, savory, and heavily peppered. It tasted like salvation, and he hated himself for enjoying it. "Pass the salt, please," Clara said, breaking the heavy silence. Arthur slid the shaker across the scarred wood. Their fingers brushed, just a fleeting scrape of calloused skin against calloused skin. Both of them pulled back a fraction of a second too fast. "You can take the room at the top of the stairs," Arthur said, his voice rougher than usual. "The lock sticks. Just push hard." "I wake at 4, Clara informed him, wiping her mouth with a cloth napkin. "I'll need to know where you keep the fencing tools. Saw a break in the line by the south ridge on our way in." Calves will get through that if the snow drives them down. Arthur looked at her, truly looked at her. Her gray eyes were unreadable, walled off behind years of hard living. I usually do the fence line. You have a tractor in pieces and 50 head of cattle that need winter feed hauled. You can't be in 2 places at once, she countered, standing up and gathering the empty bowls. I earn my keep, Mr. Hayes. Point me to the tools. The next morning, the frost was thick on the windows, casting a pale, icy blue light into the kitchen. Arthur descended the stairs at 4:30, expecting a dark house. Instead, the smell of strong black coffee hit him. Clara was already in her boots, her heavy jacket zipped to her chin. She was drinking coffee from a chipped mug, a pair of heavy leather work gloves tucked under her arm. By noon, the temperature hadn't broken freezing, but Clara was sweating. She was 2 miles out on the south ridge, a post-hole digger in her hands. The earth was hard, resisting the steel blades. She brought the heavy tool down with a grunt, her shoulders burning. Arthur rode out on a massive bay gelding to check on her progress around 1 o'clock. He sat atop the horse, watching her work from a distance. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't complained. She just attacked the frozen earth with a steady, relentless rhythm. He nudged the gelding forward. Earth's frozen solid. You'll break your back. Clara didn't pause. She dropped a new cedar post into the hole, grabbed the heavy tamping bar, and began packing the dirt around it. Back's been broken before. It healed. Arthur dismounted, tying the gelding to a solid post. He walked over, grabbing a second tamping bar from the back of the utility UTV Clara had driven out. He didn't speak. He just stepped up to the opposite side of the post and mirrored her rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. They worked in perfect unspoken synchronization. The only sounds were the heavy thud of iron against dirt, their synchronized breathing and the wind rustling through the dead grass. Arthur watched the way Clara's jaw set, the determined line of her mouth. There was no softness in her, but there was a fierce, undeniable strength. Suddenly, a jackrabbit darted from the brush, right under the gelding's hooves. The horse spooked, rearing up with a terrified whinny, its front hooves lashing the air. Arthur turned to shout a command to the horse, but his voice died in his throat. Clara had dropped the heavy iron bar. She was backed against the barbed wire, her eyes wide with a sudden blind panic. Her breathing hitched, shallow and ragged. She wasn't seeing the frost or the ridge or Arthur. She was staring at the rearing horse with a terror so raw it made Arthur's chest tight. "Easy, boy," Arthur barked, grabbing the reins near the bit, forcing the gelding's head down until all 4 hooves were planted. He stroked the horse's neck, murmuring low, calming words, but his eyes were fixed on Clara. She was shaking. It took her a full 10 seconds to pull herself back to the present. She blinked rapidly, her gray eyes refocusing on the frozen dirt. She swallowed hard, her throat working, then leaned down and picked up the heavy iron bar with trembling hands. She didn't offer an explanation. Arthur didn't ask for one. "Post is set," Clara said, her voice strained, entirely devoid of its usual grit. She turned and walked toward the UTV, her back rigid. Arthur watched her go, the silence stretching between them, heavy with the weight of invisible ghosts. He realized then that Clara wasn't just a woman running out of luck. She was a woman running from a ghost, and the Hayes Ranch was just another place to hide. November arrived with a brutal cold that turned the mud to iron and the sky the color of bruised slate. Clara's life had settled into a relentless rhythm. Up at 4, stoking the stove, making breakfast, mending fences, hauling feed, and then, in the dim hours of the afternoon, she would retreat to the barn. The radiator of her Ford lay on Arthur's oily workbench like a patient on a surgical table. She spent hours grinding down the cracked seams, her face hidden behind a scarred welding mask, the blue-white sparks illuminating the dark corners of the barn. She told herself she was working fast, so she could leave before the deep snows trapped her here. But every time she fired up the torch, her hands moved just a fraction slower. She was getting attached, and it terrified her. It wasn't Arthur. Arthur was a brick wall of a man, polite but distant, buried under the weight of his own grief. It was the girl's. "You're doing it wrong." Clara killed the torch and pushed the mask up. Lily was standing by the workbench, a thick length of hemp rope in her small hands. She was attempting a bowline knot, her face scrunched up in frustration. "I told you Rabbit comes out of the hole around the tree and back down the hole," Clara said, pulling off her heavy welding gloves. She stepped around the bench, kneeling down to Lily's eye level. She didn't take the rope from the girl. Instead, she guided Lily's small, dirt-stained fingers with her own calloused ones. "You're strangling the rabbit. Give it slack." Maisie hung upside down from the loft ladder nearby, watching them. "Dad says knots don't matter as long as they hold." "Your dad is a rancher, not a sailor," Clara replied, her voice dry. "And a bad knot will fail you exactly when you need it to hold your life." "Try again, Lily." Clara watched the child concentrate. She felt a dangerous warmth bloom in her chest. She remembered how empty her own trailer had felt, the silence so loud it rang in her ears after John's funeral. Now she was surrounded by the chaotic, messy noise of life. She stood up abruptly, stepping away. "Keep practicing. I need more argon gas for the welder." She walked out of the barn, letting the freezing air hit her face to clear her head. She needed to focus. She needed to fix the truck. She needed to leave before she started believing this could be hers. As she crossed the dirt yard toward the tool shed, a heavy-duty Dodge Ram came tearing up the driveway, its mud tires churning up the frozen ruts. It stopped aggressively close to the porch, and a man stepped out. He was thick-necked, wearing a pristine Stetson and a coat lined with sheepskin. He didn't look like a man who worked the land. He looked like a man who owned people who worked the land. Clara stopped in her tracks, her hand instinctively resting on her belt. Arthur emerged from the horse stalls, wiping his hands on a rag. His posture stiffened immediately. "Judson, you're trespassing." Judson chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Just being a good neighbor, Arthur. Heard you were having trouble making the banknote on the south pasture. My offer still stands. I'll take it off your hands for 40 cents on the dollar." "The south pasture isn't for sale," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and flat. "And you know the way out." Judson didn't move. His small, piggy eyes drifted past Arthur and landed on Clara. He took in her grease-stained face, her faded men's flannel, and the heavy boots. A greasy, knowing smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Judson drawled, leaning against the hood of his truck. "I heard a rumor down at the feed store, but I didn't believe it. Said Arthur Hayes had finally lost his mind and taken in a stray. Didn't realize you were running a charity for lot lizards, Arthur. Or is she paying her rent on her back?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara didn't flinch. She had heard worse from better men. She simply stared at Judson with dead, gray eyes, assessing exactly where to strike him if he took a step closer. But Arthur moved first. He didn't shout. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply closed the distance between himself and Judson in 3 long, predatory strides. Before Judson could react, Arthur grabbed the lapels of the man's expensive sheepskin coat, his massive fists twisting the fabric tight against Judson's throat, and slammed him hard against the grill of the Dodge. The heavy thud of bone against metal echoed in the yard. "Listen to me very carefully, Judson." Arthur spoke in a voice so quiet, so devoid of emotion it was terrifying. "That woman has done more honest work on this land in 3 weeks than you've done in your miserable life. You breathe another word about her, you look at her again, and I will beat you until you can't remember your own name. Do you understand me?" Judson was gasping, his face turning purple, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Arthur's iron grip. He managed a frantic, choking nod. Arthur shoved him away with disgust. "Get off my property!" Judson scrambled into his truck, not bothering to wipe the mud from his coat, and threw the engine into reverse, tearing out of the driveway faster than he had arrived. Arthur stood in the yard, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched at his sides. He didn't turn to look at Clara. Clara watched his back. For the first time in years, she felt a strange, terrifying sensation. She felt protected. not by a gun or her own fists, but by a man who had nothing to gain from it. She walked over to him slowly. The first flakes of a new snow began to fall, drifting down like white ash from a cold sky. They landed on Arthur's dark hair and Clara's shoulders. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said quietly. "I fight my own battles." Arthur finally turned to her. The anger in his eyes was fading, replaced by a profound, weary exhaustion. He looked at the grease on her cheek, the exhaustion lining her eyes, and the defiant set of her jaw. "You shouldn't have to," Arthur said, his voice rough. "Not here." He didn't say anything else. He didn't touch her. He just turned and walked toward the house, leaving Clara standing alone in the yard as the snow began to fall heavier, burying the dirt, the tracks, and the last of her excuses to leave. Clara looked toward the barn, where her half-fixed radiator lay. Then she looked toward the house, where the golden light of the kitchen window spilled out onto the snow, and where she knew two little girls were waiting for her to finish teaching them how to tie a knot that would hold. She shoved her cold hands deep into her pockets, the snow stinging her cheeks. Just until the spring, she lied to herself. Just until the spring. The engine of the 1984 Ford fired up on the third turn of the key. It didn't sputter, and it didn't wheeze. It roared to life with a deep, steady idle that vibrated through the floorboards and settled into Clara's bones. To a mechanic, it was the sound of success. To Clara, sitting behind the cracked vinyl steering wheel with grease under her fingernails and a streak of motor oil across her jaw, it sounded like a death knell. She let the truck run, watching the temperature gauge slowly climb and stabilize right in the center. No leaks. The welds had held. The radiator was as solid as it was going to get. She had done exactly what she had promised Arthur Hayes she would do. And now, the invisible contract that bound her to this piece of land was fulfilled. From the doorway of the barn, Arthur stood with a pitchfork in his hand, watching the exhaust plume billow white against the gray afternoon air. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer a word of congratulations. He just watched the truck idle, his expression carved from the same hard granite as the mountains looming behind the property. Clara killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise had been. She stepped out, wiping her hands on a heavily stained rag. "She's holding coolant. Thermostat is opening right on time. I'll need to do a test drive down to the county line and back to be sure, but she's road ready." Arthur drove the tines of the pitchfork into the dirt floor of the barn. He leaned his weight against the wooden handle, the leather of his gloves creaking. "Radio says there's a low-pressure system moving over the divide. Supposed to hit by tomorrow night. They're calling for 20 inches of snow and 40-mile-an-hour winds." "Then I'll be out of your hair by morning," Clara said. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Instead, she busied herself with gathering her socket wrenches, dropping them one by one into her battered red metal toolbox. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was sharp and final. "I'll pack my gear tonight, leave before the frost sets on the asphalt." "The roads will be black ice by dawn," Arthur said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection, a flat, pragmatic statement of fact. "If that radiator blows again on the pass, you'll freeze to death in that cab before the plows ever find you." "I've survived worse than a stalled truck," Clara replied, snapping the latch of the toolbox shut. "I appreciate the shelter, Hayes, and the tools, but a deal is a deal." "Is it the money?" Arthur asked suddenly. It was a clumsy question, lacking his usual stoicism. "Because I can pay you a fair wage to stay through the winter. The herd needs looking after, and the girls listen to you." Clara finally looked up. Arthur was standing stiffly, his shoulders tense. He looked like a man who was used to bleeding in silence, suddenly asking for a bandage. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting he needed help. "It's not the money," Clara said quietly. She picked up her toolbox and walked past him, the chill of the barn seeping through her flannel shirt. She didn't tell him that the real reason she had to leave was because earlier that morning, Maisie had climbed into her lap while she was drinking coffee and fallen asleep against her chest. She didn't tell him that she had started looking for Arthur's silhouette against the skyline every time he rode out to the pastures. She couldn't stay. She was a woman who carried a void, and this family had already suffered enough loss without her adding to it, when she inevitably broke under the weight of her own memories. That evening, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse was suffocating. Clara had cooked a roast using the last of the root vegetables from the cellar. She set the table with a mechanical efficiency. Maisie and Lily sat unusually quiet, their eyes darting between Arthur and Clara. Children, Clara had long ago realized, were like barometers for unspoken grief. They felt the dropping pressure long before the storm hit. "Are you taking Barnaby?" Lily asked softly, pushing a carrot around her plate with her fork. Clara stopped cutting her meat. "Barnaby is my dog, Lily. Where I go, he goes." "But he likes the rug by the stove," Maisie chimed in, her lower lip trembling slightly. "He's old. The truck is cold." "He's a tough old bird," Clara lied, her throat tightening. "He's used to the road." Arthur didn't say a word. He ate his dinner with a grim, punishing focus, his jaw clenching with every bite. When he finished, he stood up, scraped his plate into the slop bucket, and put on his heavy coat. "I'm going to check the windbreaks in the north pasture," he announced to the room at large. "Make sure the tarps are tied down before the wind picks up." "I'll help you," Clara said instinctively, standing up. "No need," Arthur replied sharply, not looking at her. "I can handle my own land. You have packing to do." The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in the kitchen. Clara stood frozen by the table, staring at the heavy oak door. The dismissal stung, a sharp physical ache in her chest. But she told herself it was for the best. A clean break was always better than a jagged tear. She spent the next hour washing the dishes, scrubbing the cast iron until her knuckles were raw. Once the kitchen was spotless, she ushered the girls upstairs to their shared bedroom. "Story time?" Lily asked hopefully as Clara tucked the heavy wool blankets around them. "Not tonight," Clara said gently. She didn't trust her voice to read without breaking. "Go to sleep. The wind is going to get loud tonight." She turned the kerosene lamp down low and stepped out into the hallway. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the synchronized breathing of the twins. She closed her eyes, committing the sound to memory. Then she walked to her own room at the end of the hall. Her packing took less than 10 minutes. A duffel bag of clothes, a worn shaving kit for her toiletries, and a small, faded photograph of John standing beside his horse. She placed the bag by the door. Downstairs, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes. Clara walked over to the frost-rimmed window and rubbed a circle in the glass. The night was pitch black, devoid of stars. The storm front was moving in faster than the radio had predicted. Through the darkness, she saw a flicker of light out by the north pasture. It was Arthur's flashlight, a tiny, fragile beam against the overwhelming dark. He was out there alone, fighting the wind, securing tarps over hay bales to keep his cattle from starving. Clara looked at her packed duffel bag. Then she looked down at Barnaby, who was snoring softly on the braided rug, his arthritic legs twitching in a dream. "Damn it," she whispered. She turned away from the window, grabbed her heavy canvas coat, her leather work gloves, and her flashlight. She didn't bother putting on a hat. She took the stairs 2 at a time, shoved her feet into her frozen boots by the door, and stepped out into the night. The cold was a physical blow. The wind whipped her hair across her face, carrying sharp, biting particles of ice that stung her skin. She kept her head down, leaning into the gale, using her flashlight to navigate the rutted path toward the north pasture. She found Arthur struggling with a massive canvas tarp. The wind had caught one corner of it, turning it into a chaotic, snapping sail. Arthur was using his entire body weight, leaning back on the heavy hemp rope, his boots sliding in the frozen mud as he desperately tried to winch it down over the stack of alfalfa bales. He was losing the battle. The wind roared, ripping the rope through his leather gloves. Clara didn't shout. She dropped her flashlight, lunged forward, and grabbed the rope right behind Arthur's hands. She threw her weight backward, digging the heels of her boots into the dirt. Arthur jolted at the sudden addition of strength. He snapped his head back, his eyes widening as he saw Clara, her face pale in the ambient light, her jaw locked in grim determination. "Pull!" Clara roared over the wind. Together they hauled backward. The combined strength of two people who were used to fighting the world alone finally broke the wind's hold on the canvas. The tarp snapped down over the bales. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the steel grommet, looped the rope through it, and tied off a perfect, unyielding trucker's hitch, securing it to the heavy wooden pallet beneath. They stood there in the dark, chests heaving, the wind screaming around them. "I told you I didn't need help," Arthur shouted, though the anger in his voice was thin, stripped away by the raw reality of the storm. "You're a liar, Hayes," Clara shouted back, refusing to back down. "And a bad one. If that tarp blew off, half your winter feed would be rotten by Tuesday." Arthur stared at her. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across his eyes. He stepped closer to her, closing the distance between them until they were mere inches apart. The air between them felt suddenly charged, hotter than the freezing gale tearing at their coats. "Why did you come out here, Clara?" Arthur demanded, his voice dropping below the roar of the wind, demanding an honesty they had both been avoiding. "If you're leaving, then leave. Don't do this. Don't act like this is your land to protect." Clara looked up at him. She saw the exhaustion, the fear, and the desperate hidden hope in his eyes. She wanted to run. Every instinct honed by trauma screamed at her to turn around, get in her truck, and drive until the mountains were in the rearview mirror. But she couldn't move. "I came out here because the knot was slipping," Clara said, her voice shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization of her own heart. "And I don't let things fall apart if I can help it." Arthur reached out. He didn't grab her arm or her shoulder. His heavy gloved hand came up and gently brushed the ice-caked hair away from her cheek. The touch was painfully tender, a stark contrast to the brutal violence of the storm around them. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into the touch for one fraction of a second, before stepping back. "The storm's hitting early," Clara said, her voice turning brittle. "We need to get to the house." She turned and walked back toward the glow of the farmhouse windows, leaving Arthur standing by the secured hay, his hand still suspended in the freezing air. Neither of them slept that night. They sat in separate rooms, listening to the wind tear at the shingles, both knowing that by morning the roads would be impassable and the real storm was yet to come. The morning did not bring light. It brought a blinding, suffocating whiteness. Clara woke to a house so cold she could see her own breath pluming in the air above her bed. The windows of her room were completely encased in hoarfrost. She threw off the heavy wool blankets, her body immediately seizing from the chill. She pulled on her thickest long johns, 2 pairs of wool socks, her denim jeans, and a heavy wool sweater before stepping out into the hallway. The house was eerily silent, save for the relentless demonic howling of the wind tearing at the eaves. She ran downstairs. The kitchen stove was dead. Arthur was gone. Clara cursed under her breath. She grabbed a handful of kindling and struck a match, desperately coaxing a fire to life in the cast-iron belly of the stove. As the first licks of warmth began to radiate, the heavy front door slammed open, bringing a violent swirl of snow into the entryway. Arthur stood in the doorway, looking like a snow ghost. He was covered head to toe in white, his face wrapped in a wool scarf, his eyebrows frozen solid. He was breathing hard, slamming his shoulder against the door to force it shut against the gale. "The power lines are down on the county road," Arthur gasped, tearing his scarf down. His face was a raw, wind-burned red. "Generator in the barn won't turn over. It's too cold." "How are the cattle?" Clara asked, immediately kicking into survival mode. "Huddled in the south draw, but the wind is changing direction. If it hits them head-on, they'll freeze on their feet," Arthur said, shedding his snow-caked coat. "I need to get the tractor out, plow a path to the lower barn, and drive them inside." "I'm coming with you," Clara stated, reaching for her canvas coat. "No," Arthur said firmly. "It's a whiteout out there, Clara. You can't see 3 feet in front of your face. You stay here with the girls. Keep the fire hot. If the pipes freeze, we're done." Before Clara could argue, the sound of small footsteps thundered down the wooden stairs. Maisie appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her eyes wide with terror, clutching a tattered teddy bear. "Dad!" Maisie cried, her voice trembling. "Dad! Lily is gone!" The blood drained from Arthur's face. "What do you mean she's gone? She's upstairs." "No," Maisie sobbed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She woke up before me. She saw Barnaby scratching at the back door. She said he needed to pee. She took him out, but she didn't come back." The door blew shut. Clara felt a sickening jolt in her stomach. She looked at the back door in the mudroom. The deadbolt wasn't thrown. Arthur didn't speak. A sound tore from his throat. A feral, gutted noise of a father realizing his worst nightmare had just come true. He lunged for the back door, throwing it open. The whiteout roared into the mudroom, a solid wall of driving snow that instantly obscured the porch steps. "Lily!" Arthur screamed into the void. The wind snatched his voice and shredded it instantly. "Lily!" He grabbed his coat and plunged into the storm without a second thought. Clara didn't hesitate. The ghosts of her past, the terror of a runaway horse, the smell of the hospital, the crushing weight of loss, screamed at her to stay inside, to protect herself, to hide. She ignored them all. She grabbed a heavy coil of nylon climbing rope from the pantry pegboard, tied one end securely around the heavy iron leg of the kitchen stove, and tied the other end around her waist in a tight bowline knot. "Stay by the fire, Maisie," Clara commanded, her voice dropping into the absolute, terrifying calm of a survivor. "Do not open this door." Clara stepped out into the blizzard, shutting the door behind her. The cold was absolute. It felt like being repeatedly struck with a baseball bat. The snow was driving horizontally, stinging her eyes like ground glass. She could see nothing. No barn, no trees, no Arthur. Just a violent, spinning vortex of white. "Arthur!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her vocal cords. Nothing. She moved forward, letting the nylon rope play out behind her. She knew the layout of the yard. The barn was 40 yards at a 2 o'clock vector from the back porch. The tool shed was 50 yards at 11 o'clock. Where would a 7-year-old dog and a 7-year-old girl go? Barnaby had bad hips. He wouldn't go far in deep snow. He would seek shelter. The wind was blowing from the north. The house would create an eddy, a small pocket of slower wind on its south side, near the old stone root cellar. Clara changed direction, fighting her way around the perimeter of the house, keeping one hand grazing the rough cedar siding to maintain her bearings. The snow was already up to her thighs, dragging at her legs like wet cement. "Barnaby!" she yelled. "Lily!" She reached the corner of the house. The wind here was slightly less brutal, blocked by the bulk of the structure. She dropped to her knees, sweeping her gloved hands through the deep drifts. Her hand struck something solid. Fur. "Barnaby!" Clara dropped down, frantically digging away the snow. The old sheepdog was curled into a tight ball against the stone foundation of the root cellar. He was shivering violently, but as Clara dug deeper, she realized he wasn't just protecting himself. Tucked entirely beneath the dog's heavy body, shielded by his thick gray fur and the stone wall, was Lily. The girl was unconscious, her lips a terrifying shade of blue, her small hands tucked into her armpits. "Lily," Clara gasped, pulling the child into her arms. She was freezing. Clara ripped off her own heavy canvas coat, wrapping it tightly around the small girl, exposing herself to the biting wind in nothing but a wool sweater. "Arthur!" Clara screamed again, clutching the child to her chest. A shadow materialized out of the whiteout. Arthur stumbled around the corner of the house, covered in snow, his eyes wild with a manic panic. When he saw Clara kneeling in the snow with his daughter in her arms, he dropped to his knees beside them. "Lily! Oh, God! Lily!" Arthur choked out, pulling both Clara and the child against his chest. "She's alive!" "Barnaby kept her warm," Clara yelled over the wind, her teeth chattering violently. "The rope! Follow the rope!" Arthur saw the nylon line tied to Clara's waist. He scooped Lily up into his arms, burying her face in his neck. Clara grabbed Barnaby by the collar, hauling the heavy, stiff dog to his feet. Together, they followed the lifeline back through the blinding storm, fighting for every inch until their hands found the wooden frame of the back door. They collapsed into the mudroom, the heat of the house washing over them like a physical blow. Arthur kicked the door shut and carried Lily straight to the kitchen stove, laying her gently on the braided rug. Maisie was beside them in a second, crying and clutching her sister's hand. Clara fell to her knees beside the fire, her body shaking uncontrollably, her sweater crusted with ice. She began rubbing Barnaby's legs vigorously, ignoring the pain in her own frozen fingers. "Get blankets," Arthur ordered Maisie. He stripped off Lily's frozen coat and boots, wrapping her in a dry wool blanket. He rubbed her hands, his own face pale with terror. "Come on, baby girl. Come back to me." For 5 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the kitchen was the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the adults. Then Lily coughed. Lily, a small, weak sound. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing tired brown eyes. She looked at Arthur, then over to Clara and the dog. "Barnaby had to pee," Lily whispered, her teeth chattering. Arthur let out a sob, a harsh, broken sound that seemed to tear his chest apart. He buried his face in his daughter's neck, crying freely, the iron walls he had built around himself for 2 years, completely collapsing. Clara sat back on her heels, watching them. The father, the 2 daughters, and the old dog. They were a mess. They were broken, grieving, and entirely imperfect. And sitting there, shivering in her frozen clothes, Clara realized with absolute clarity that there was nowhere else on earth she wanted to be. An hour later, the crisis had passed. The girls were asleep on the rug in front of the stove, buried under a mountain of blankets. Barnaby was snoring beside them. The storm outside still raged, but inside the kitchen, the fire cast a warm, golden glow over the scarred oak table. Clara was sitting in a wooden chair, her hands wrapped around a mug of scalding black coffee. She was wearing one of Arthur's oversized flannel shirts, her hair drying in damp tangles. Arthur was kneeling on the floor near her feet, a pair of heavy iron tongs in his hands, shifting the logs in the stove. He placed the tongs on the hearth and stayed on his knees, surrounded by the sawdust and wood chips on the floor. He didn't stand up. He turned to look at Clara. The silence between them was different now. The tension was gone, burned away by the raw terror of the whiteout. Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the woman who had rebuilt a truck, fenced a ridge, and walked into a blizzard without a coat to save a child that wasn't hers. "I was a dead man," Arthur said quietly, his voice raspy from shouting in the wind. "For 2 years I've just been walking around, waiting for the dirt to cover me. I thought keeping everyone out was the only way to keep the girls safe." Clara looked down at her coffee mug, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We all find ways to survive, Arthur. Doesn't mean they're good ways." "You were right," he continued, his eyes locked on her face. "You don't let things fall apart. You pulled this family back together, Clara. You brought the blood back into this house." Arthur shifted closer on his knees. He reached up, his large, calloused hands gently taking the coffee mug from her trembling fingers and setting it on the table. He took her hands in his. They were rough, scarred, and strong. "A month ago," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that carried more weight than any vow. "2 little girls walked up to me covered in mud and told me they found a wife for me. I thought it was the craziest thing I ever heard." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked into his eyes and saw the walls completely gone. "I'm not asking you to stay for them, Clara," Arthur said, his thumbs gently rubbing the knuckles of her hands. "I'm asking you to stay because I can't look at that kitchen table without wanting to see you sitting there. I can't look out at the ridge without wanting to see you riding beside me. The girls found you, but I'm the one who needs you." He didn't pull a ring from his pocket. He didn't make grand, sweeping promises about a perfect future, because they both knew the world was too hard for perfect. "Stay," Arthur pleaded, the single word carrying the weight of his entire soul. "Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to be a man worthy of the woman who walked into the ice for my daughter." Clara looked at the man kneeling in the sawdust. She thought of her packed duffel bag sitting in the cold room upstairs. She thought of the ghost she had been running from and realized for the first time in 3 years, the ghost wasn't chasing her anymore. She had outrun it. She squeezed his hands, her gray eyes softening, filling with tears she finally allowed herself to shed. "You're going to have to pull my truck out of the barn, Hayes," Clara whispered, a watery, brilliant smile breaking across her face. "I don't need it anymore." Arthur let out a breathless laugh, standing up and pulling her out of the chair and into his arms. He held her tight against his chest, burying his face in her damp hair. It wasn't the embrace of a romance novel. It was the desperate, crushing grip of a man holding on to his lifeline. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and home. 6 months later, the spring thaw had turned the valley green. The snow was gone, replaced by wildflowers and the muddy chaos of calving season. On the front porch of the Hayes Ranch, the sun beat down warm and bright. Sitting in the dirt yard, right where the driveway met the grass, was the rusted cab of a 1984 Ford. The tires were gone, the engine block was removed, and the hood had been taken off. Inside the engine bay, Clara had planted a massive bed of bright yellow black-eyed Susans. She stood on the porch, wiping dirt from her hands onto her denim overalls, watching Maisie and Lily chase Barnaby around the flower bed. The screen door creaked open behind her, and Arthur stepped out, handing her a mug of black coffee. He wrapped a strong arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Clara leaned into him, resting her hand over his. They didn't need to speak. They stood together on the porch, watching the flowers bloom in the rusted shell of her past, firmly rooted in the soil of their future. The transition from a solitary survivor to a partner was not an overnight miracle. It was a slow, agonizing thaw, much like the winter receding from the Wyoming Valley. The blizzard that had nearly claimed Lily's life had broken the ice between Clara and Arthur, but the aftermath left them navigating a treacherous, muddy terrain of new boundaries and old fears. January bled into February. The snowbanks shrank, exposing the dead, yellowed grass of the pastures and turning the ranch yard into a sprawling sea of thick, sucking mud. Clara moved her few belongings from the guest room into Arthur's room at the end of the hall. The first night she slept beside him, she lay rigidly awake for hours, listening to the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing. When he instinctively reached out in his sleep, his heavy arm wrapping around her waist to pull her back against his broad chest, Clara had squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the sudden, terrifying urge to bolt. But she had stayed, and by the 3rd week, she found herself waking up before the alarm, simply to watch the pale morning light cast shadows across the hard plains of his face. She was no longer the hired help, but she worked twice as hard to prove she wasn't a burden. One bleak Tuesday afternoon, Clara walked into the kitchen, shedding her mud-caked boots by the door. The house was quiet. The twins were at the kitchen table, painstakingly copying letters into their school workbooks. Arthur sat at the head of the table, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, staring at a leather-bound ledger. He didn't look up when the door shut. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the kind of silent desperation Clara knew intimately. She walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. The muscles beneath his flannel shirt were coiled tight as a spring. "How bad is it?" she asked softly. Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a dry rasp. He took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The blizzard took a toll. We lost 12 head of cattle in the North Draw, mostly bred heifers. They just huddled together and froze upright." Clara felt a dull ache in her chest. 12 bred heifers wasn't just a loss of livestock. It was the loss of the spring calf crop, the lifeblood of the ranch's annual income. "What does it mean for the note?" "It means we're short," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion, a defense mechanism against panic. "The balloon payment for the south pasture is due on the 1st of April. If we don't make it, the bank forecloses on that acreage. And without the spring water on the south pasture, the rest of the ranch won't survive the summer drought." "How short?" Arthur hesitated, his pride warring with the new reality of their partnership. He looked up at her, his dark eyes shadowed. 8,000. It might as well have been 1,000,000. Clara looked at the ledger, at the neat columns of numbers written in Arthur's heavy hand, documenting a slow, agonizing slide into ruin. She thought of her $32. She thought of the rusted Ford out in the barn. "We'll sell the truck," Clara said immediately. "The radiator is new. The engine block is solid. It's a classic body. Some collector in Cheyenne will pay—" "No," Arthur cut her off, his voice suddenly sharp. He reached up, covering her hand on his shoulder with his own. "I am not selling the only thing you brought into this marriage. That truck was your husband's." "My husband is dead, Arthur," Clara said, her voice steady, stripping the sentimentality from the air. "And this ranch is alive. Your daughters are alive. You think I care about a piece of rusted steel when this family is on the line?" "I said no, Clara." Arthur stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. The twins looked up, startled by the sudden tension. Arthur lowered his voice, but the granite resolve remained. A man doesn't save his land by pawning his woman's past. "I'll go to the bank in town tomorrow. Ask for an extension." "Banks don't give extensions on dead cattle," Clara shot back, the mechanic in her frustrated by his stubborn pride. "Arthur, be practical." "I am being practical," he snapped. "I am the head of this house. I will figure it out." He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his coat and walked out the back door, leaving Clara standing by the table, her hands clenched into fists. It was their first real fight. It tasted like ash and copper. "Is Dad mad at you?" Lily whispered, her large brown eyes wide with worry. Clara took a slow, deep breath, forcing her hands to unclench. She walked over to the girls, pressing a kiss to the top of Lily's dark head. "No, little bird. Your dad is just scared. And scared men sometimes mistake pride for armor." The next day, Arthur drove into town. Clara didn't wait for him to return. She put on her heavy canvas coat and walked out to the barn. The air inside was freezing, smelling of old hay and spilled diesel. She walked past her repaired Ford and stopped in front of the John Deere tractor. It was a massive, hulking beast of green steel. Arthur had been trying to rebuild the transmission and the rear axle assembly for a year, but ranch work always pulled him away. It was sitting on heavy wooden blocks, its guts spilled out on the dirt floor. Clara pulled her hair back into a tight braid. She picked up a heavy shop rag and began wiping the grime off a set of planetary gears. When Arthur returned just after sunset, his face told her everything she needed to know. The bank had said no. He walked into the barn, finding Clara lying on a mechanic's creeper beneath the belly of the tractor, a drop light illuminating the greasy undercarriage. "What are you doing?" Arthur asked, his voice exhausted. Clara rolled out from under the machine, grease smeared across her forehead, a heavy socket wrench in her hand. "I called Henderson down at the feed store. Asked him what a fully rebuilt, field-ready John Deere 4440 goes for at the spring agricultural auction in Casper." Arthur frowned. "That tractor hasn't run in 2 years. The transmission casing is cracked, and the hydraulic pump is shot." "I know," Clara said, sitting up and wiping her hands. "I can weld the casing. The pump needs new seals and a remachined impeller. I pulled the schematics from the manual in your glove box." "Clara, it's a 3-week job for a full crew in a heated shop," Arthur said, rubbing his eyes. "You can't rebuild a heavy diesel transmission on a dirt floor in freezing temperatures." "Watch me," Clara said, her gray eyes flashing with a fierce, terrifying light in the dim barn. "You told me yesterday you wouldn't let me sell my truck to save this ranch. Fine. You keep your pride. But you do not get to tell me I can't use my own 2 hands to fight for my home. You do the ranching. Let me do the wrenching." Arthur stared at her. He saw the grease, the dirt, the sheer unyielding stubbornness in her jaw. He realized then that she wasn't just offering help. She was staking her claim. She was weaving herself into the very fabric of the Hayes Ranch, mixing her sweat and blood with the oil and dirt of his land. He slowly sank down onto an overturned wooden crate, resting his forearms on his knees. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a profound, overwhelming awe. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara," he whispered. "I'm your stubborn woman," Clara corrected him softly. She set the wrench down and walked over to him, kneeling in the dirt between his knees. She reached up, cupping his cold, wind-burned face in her greasy hands. "We are partners, Arthur. You carry the sky, and I'll carry the iron. We don't do this alone anymore." Arthur closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the weight of the world lifting just a fraction of an inch off his shoulders. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay, what do you need?" "I need you to keep the girls out of the barn so I don't teach them any new curse words," Clara said, a faint smile touching her lips. "And I need strong black coffee. Every 4 hours." For the next 21 days, the barn became a sanctuary of sparks and steel. Clara worked like a woman possessed. She stripped the transmission down to its individual bearings. She TIG-welded the cracked cast-iron casing, a delicate, grueling process that required preheating the heavy metal with a blowtorch to prevent it from shattering. She fabricated new hydraulic lines, her hands covered in tiny, bloody nicks from the braided steel wire. Arthur held true to his word. He handled the cattle, the cooking, and the girls. But every night, at midnight, he would walk into the barn carrying a thermos of coffee and 2 thick sandwiches. He would sit on the wooden crate and watch her work. He didn't offer advice, he just offered his presence. When her arms shook from the weight of lifting heavy gears, his hands would appear beside hers, silently bearing the load. By the 3rd week of March, the mud outside had begun to dry, and the first green shoots of spring grass were breaking through the frost. Inside the barn, Clara stood before the reassembled John Deere. It wasn't painted or polished, but it was whole. Every bolt was torqued to spec. Every line was bled. Arthur stood beside her, holding his breath. Maisie and Lily peeked from behind the barn doors, their eyes wide. Clara climbed up into the high cab. Her back screamed in agony. Her knuckles were raw and swollen, and she was so exhausted she felt physically ill. She pushed the clutch in, turned the key to engage the glow plugs, and counted to 10. She turned the ignition. The massive diesel engine cranked once, twice, and then caught with a deafening, thunderous roar. Black smoke shot from the exhaust stack, clearing instantly into a smooth, powerful hum. The floor of the barn vibrated. Clara engaged the hydraulics. The heavy front loader bucket lifted smoothly off the ground, stopping perfectly in midair, without a single shudder or leak. She killed the engine and rested her forehead against the steering wheel, a single hot tear cutting a clean track through the grease on her cheek. The door of the cab swung open. Arthur climbed up onto the step, ignoring the dirt. He reached into the cab, wrapped his arms around her waist, and dragged her out of the seat, burying his face in her neck. He didn't say thank you. The way he held her, as if she were the very air he breathed, was gratitude enough. "We go to Casper tomorrow," Arthur whispered against her hair. "We save our home." The Casper Agricultural Auction was a chaotic sea of cattle trailers, muddy pickup trucks, and men in Stetson hats shouting over the roar of diesel engines. The air smelled of manure, roasted peanuts, and exhaust. Arthur had hauled the John Deere into town on a borrowed flatbed. It sat in the heavy machinery lot, gleaming dully under the pale spring sun. It wasn't the prettiest tractor on the lot, but it was a workhorse, and in Wyoming men paid for muscle, not paint. Clara stood by the massive rear tire, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her clean denim jacket. She was vibrating with a nervous energy she couldn't suppress. Beside her, Arthur was a silent, imposing monolith, his eyes tracking the crowd gathering around the auctioneer's podium. "Lot 42!" The auctioneer's voice crackled through the PA system, sharp and rapid fire. "We got a John Deere 444. Oh. Complete rebuild on the tranny and hydraulics. She ain't a beauty queen, boys, but she'll pull a mountain. Let's start the bidding at 5,000. 5! A voice shouted from the back. "I got 5 looking for 6. 6,000 to the gentleman in the Carhartt." The bidding climbed quickly to 7,000, then slowed. Clara felt her stomach twist into a cold knot. 8,000. They needed 8,000 to satisfy the banknote and leave enough for spring seed. 7.5. I have 7.5. Looking for 8. Come on, boys. The rubber on those tires alone is worth 2, the auctioneer cajoled. 7,600, a smooth, oily voice drawled from the front of the crowd. Arthur stiffened. Clara looked over. Judson was standing near the podium, wearing a pristine white cowboy hat and a smug, predatory smile. He looked directly at Arthur, his eyes glinting with malice. He knew exactly what the Hayes Ranch needed to survive, and he was intentionally anchoring the bid to bleed them dry. 7-6 to Mr. Judson, the auctioneer called. Looking for 8. Do I hear 8? Silence fell over the crowd. Men shuffled their boots in the dirt. No one wanted to bid against Judson. He owned the largest meatpacking plant in the county, and crossing him was bad business. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She had bled over that machine for 21 days. She looked at Arthur. His jaw was locked so tight the muscle twitched, his eyes fixed on Judson with a cold, murderous intent. He was watching his land, his legacy, slip through his fingers. Going once, at 7,600. Clara couldn't breathe. It wasn't fair. After the blizzard, after the sweat and the tears, it couldn't end like this. $10,000. The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from a man walking up the gravel path toward the podium. He was older, with a weathered face and a limp leaning heavily on a wooden cane. It was Elias Thorne, a neighboring rancher who lived 5 miles north of the Hayes property. Judson spun around, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "Thorne, you don't even run a full crop operation anymore. What do you need a 444 for?" Elias limped to a stop, tipping his worn hat back. "I don't, but I know Arthur Hayes. But I know, and I know the woman he's marrying. My foreman was stuck on the pass in December with a blown alternator." Clara stopped in a blizzard, pulled the alternator apart on the side of the highway, and got him home to his kids. A machine rebuilt by a woman who works like that? It'll run until the end of the world. 10,000. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of ranchers. Out here, reputation was currency. Clara's quiet, relentless work over the long winter hadn't gone unnoticed. She hadn't just fixed a tractor, she had woven herself into the rugged community. Judson glared at Elias, then at Arthur. 10,500. 12,000, Elias countered instantly, slamming his cane into the dirt. "And I'll go to 20, Judson, just to watch you choke on it. Try me." Judson looked at the hard faces of the ranchers surrounding him. He realized he was outmatched, not by money, but by the impenetrable wall of Western solidarity. He spat a curse into the dirt, turned on his heel, and stalked away to his truck. Sold for $12,000 to Elias Thorne. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Clara let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a month. Her knees actually buckled. Arthur caught her instantly, his strong arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in her hair, and for the first time since she had met him, she heard Arthur Hayes laugh. It was a deep, booming sound that echoed across the auction lot, full of relief and pure, unadulterated joy. 2 days later, the banknote was stamped, "Paid in full." With the shadow of ruin finally lifted, the valley erupted into spring. The snowmelt swelled the creeks. The south pasture turned a brilliant, vivid green, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. They didn't want a big wedding. They didn't need the town to validate what they had forged in the ice and the mud. On a Saturday afternoon in late April, the circuit judge drove his dusty sedan up the dirt driveway of the Hayes Ranch. Clara stood in her bedroom looking at her reflection in the old standing mirror. She wasn't wearing white. She wore a simple, pale blue cotton dress she had bought in town. Her hair was down, falling in loose, dark waves over her shoulders. She wore no makeup. And her hands still bore the faint, indelible stains of grease and the scars of a hard winter. She looked like a woman who had fought a war and finally found her way home. The door creaked open. Maisie and Lily walked in. They were wearing matching yellow sundresses, their wild hair tamed into neat braids. They both held small bouquets of wild bluebonnets they had picked from the south pasture. "You look pretty," Lily said, her voice full of awe. "You look like a mom," Maisie added with the profound, devastating honesty only a child possesses. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She knelt down on the wooden floor, unmindful of her clean dress, and pulled both girls into a fierce, tight embrace. "I love you," she whispered into their hair. "Both of you. More than I ever thought I could love anything again." When Clara walked out onto the front porch, Arthur was waiting. He had shaved, and his dark hair was slicked back. He wore a clean white shirt, a dark bolo tie, and a dark suit jacket that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He took his Stetson off as she stepped through the door. The look in his eyes, so entirely stripped of grief, so full of an overwhelming, reverent love, stole the breath right out of her lungs. They stood facing each other on the scarred wooden planks of the porch, the sweeping expanse of the Wyoming Valley stretching out behind them. The judge opened his book. Barnaby the sheepdog lay at their feet, thumping his tail against the wood. The vows were short. There was no poetry, no grand declarations of fate. "I take you, Clara," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated in her chest. His thumbs gently stroked the backs of her scarred hands. "To hold my land, to raise my children, and to keep my heart. I promise to stand between you and the wind, and to never let you carry the heavy loads alone, until they put me in the ground." Clara looked up at him, tears tracking freely down her face. "I take you, Arthur," she replied, her voice breaking, then finding its strength. "To rebuild what is broken, to warm what is cold, and to love you even when the winter is hard. I choose you. I choose this family, today and every day after." Arthur slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger. It was heavy and solid. Clara slid a matching band onto his. When Arthur leaned down and kissed her, the cheers of the twins erupted from the porch steps. It was a kiss that tasted of tears, of survival, and of the deep, quiet peace that comes from finally stopping running. Later that afternoon, while the judge drank a glass of whiskey in the kitchen and the girls played in the yard, Arthur and Clara stood side by side near the edge of the driveway. Sitting in the dirt was the rusted cab of Clara's 1984 Ford. Arthur had spent the morning before the wedding, removing the engine block and filling the cavernous engine bay with rich, dark topsoil he had hauled from the riverbed. Clara held a wooden flat of bright yellow black-eyed Susans. She knelt down by the rusted grill of the truck, the blue cotton of her wedding dress pooling in the dirt. Arthur knelt beside her, his suit jacket discarded on the porch rail, his sleeves rolled up. Together they dug their hands into the dark earth. They planted the flowers deep into the soil inside the rusted shell of the truck, patting the dirt down firmly around the roots. Clara looked at her dirty hands, then at the gold band shining through the soil on her finger. She looked up at Arthur. The sun caught the lines around his eyes, lines that were no longer carved by pain, but by the simple, profound joy of being alive. They had taken the wreckage of their pasts and built something beautiful right in the center of it. The engine was gone, the road was closed, and Clara Hayes knew she was exactly where she was meant to stay. By late July, the Wyoming sun had transformed from a welcome friend into a punishing anvil. It beat down on the valley with a relentless dry fury that baked the mud of the spring thaw into cracked, jagged ceramic. The creek beds shrank to muddy trickles, and the prairie grass turned the color of old parchment. The Hayes Ranch, however, was surviving. The spring water on the south pasture, the land they had saved with the auction money, flowed cold and clear from a deep artesian well, keeping the herd watered and healthy. But moving the cattle across the sprawling acreage required daily grueling work in temperatures that routinely crested 95 degrees. Clara had spent the first 2 months of their marriage doing the heavy mechanical lifting. She had rebuilt the UTV, serviced the water pumps, and patched miles of barbed wire. But as the drought deepened, Arthur needed her out on the pasture. He needed another rider. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday morning, Clara stood by the wooden corral. Her hands rested on the top rail, the sun-bleached wood hot against her calluses. Inside the pen, Arthur was saddling a stocky, mild-mannered red roan gelding named Copper. Clara watched the tightening of the cinch, the shift of the horse's weight, the flick of its tail against the horseflies. Her mouth was bone dry, and it had nothing to do with the heat. Arthur adjusted the stirrup leathers, giving the saddle horn a firm tug to check the set. He turned and looked at her. He didn't say, "Are you ready?" He knew she wasn't. He knew about John. He knew that the last time Clara had been in a saddle was the day her first husband's Greenbroke colt had spooked at a rattlesnake, reared and fallen backward, crushing John's chest beneath 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle. For 3 years, Clara had driven trucks, fixed tractors, and walked. She had not put her boot in a stirrup. Arthur led Copper to the fence line. He handed the leather reins over the rail. "He's 14 years old, Clara. He's practically asleep right now. He knows the herd, and he knows the land. He won't quit on you, and he won't surprise you." Clara stared at the worn leather reins. Her hands were trembling. The phantom sound of breaking bone echoed in her ears, competing with the drone of the cicadas. She wanted to step back. She wanted to tell Arthur to go alone, that she would stay behind and fix something made of steel and oil, something predictable, something she could turn off with a key. But she looked past Arthur, out toward the hazy, shimmering heat of the south pasture, where 50 head of cattle needed to be moved away from a drying mud hole. Arthur couldn't do it alone. The dogs were exhausted. Clara took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of dust, horse sweat, and sagebrush. She took the reins. She climbed the fence rail and swung her leg over the saddle, settling her weight into the worn leather seat. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. Copper merely flicked an ear backward, letting out a long, shuddering breath that fluttered his nostrils, shifting his weight to accommodate her. Arthur mounted his massive bay gelding in one fluid motion. He rode up beside her, their knees nearly brushing. He reached out, his heavy, leather-gloved hand resting over hers on the saddle horn. "You're okay," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble that anchored her to the present. "I'm right beside you." "Let's move," Clara rasped, her jaw set tight. The ride out to the pasture was an exercise in pure willpower. For the first mile, Clara's posture was rigid. Her hands gripped the reins so tightly her knuckles ached. But Copper lived up to his reputation. His gait was smooth and rolling, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that required no micromanagement. Gradually, the rhythm began to work its magic. The muscle memory from a lifetime on a ranch overrode her trauma. By the time they crested the ridge overlooking the south draw, Clara had let her shoulders drop, her hips moving naturally with the horse. The herd was clustered around a shrinking, muddy depression that had once been a creek. The water was gone, leaving behind a treacherous pit of thick, sucking black mud. "They're looking for cool ground," Arthur said, his brow furrowed beneath his Stetson. "But if a calf wanders into the center of that bog, it won't get out. We need to push them up to the artesian trough." They separated, Arthur flanking wide to the right, Clara taking the left. Clara gave a sharp whistle, the sound cutting through the heavy air. Copper immediately pinned his ears and moved forward, weaving through the brush, applying pressure to the stragglers. Clara felt a sudden, fierce rush of adrenaline. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a rancher again. She was home. "Hiya!" she shouted, swinging her coiled catch rope against her leather chaps to create a sharp crack. The cattle lumbered forward, protesting the heat but moving steadily uphill. They were nearly clear when a sharp, terrified bawl shattered the air. Clara whipped her head around. Near the far edge of the mud hole, a small, white-faced Hereford calf had sunk up to its belly in the black muck. It was thrashing wildly, its panicked movements only driving it deeper into the suction of the mud. A few yards away, Lily was standing on the dry bank. Arthur had brought the girls out in the UTV earlier, parking them under the shade of a cottonwood tree with strict instructions to stay put. But Lily, possessed by a heart entirely too big for her chest, had seen the struggling calf and run down to the bank to try and coax it out. "Lily, stay back!" Arthur roared, kicking his bay into a gallop, tearing down the ridge. But Lily had already taken a step into the mud, reaching out for the calf. Instantly, the deceptive crust broke. Lily shrieked as she sank past her knees, the heavy, clay-like mud gripping her small boots like a vice. She lost her balance and pitched forward, her hands plunging into the muck. Clara didn't think. The paralyzing fear of the horse vanished, vaporized by the sight of her daughter in danger. She kicked Copper hard in the flanks. The old roan surged forward, launching into a heavy lope. Clara rode him hard down the steep, rocky embankment, her balance perfect, her body completely in sync with the animal. "Hold on, Lily!" Clara yelled. She pulled Copper to a sliding halt at the very edge of the mud hole, the horse's hooves digging deep into the dry dirt. Clara didn't dismount. Stepping into the mud would trap her too. She leaned down from the saddle, reaching out as far as she could. "Grab my hand, Lily!" The little girl was crying, her face splattered with black mud, her eyes wide with panic. "I'm stuck! It's pulling me!" "Look at me," Clara commanded, her voice cracking like a whip, demanding obedience. Lily sniffled and looked up. "I've got you. Grab my hand." Lily reached out with a muddy hand. Clara leaned precariously out of the saddle, her thigh muscles screaming as she locked her legs around Copper's barrel to keep from falling. Their fingers locked. "Hold steady, Copper," Clara murmured. Clara pulled. The mud fought back with an audible, sucking squelch. Clara gritted her teeth, using the leverage of the saddle and the raw strength in her shoulders. With a loud pop, Lily's boots ripped free from the muck. Clara hauled the crying child up, swinging her sideways across the saddle right in front of the horn. Arthur arrived a second later, his horse blowing hard. He leaped from the saddle, his face ashen, and reached for Lily. Clara handed the sobbing child down to her father. Arthur crushed Lily to his chest, burying his face in her muddy hair. "I'm sorry," Lily wailed into Arthur's shoulder. "I wanted to help the baby cow." Arthur looked up at Clara, who was still sitting atop Copper, chest heaving, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. "You got her," Arthur breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You rode." "I rode," Clara agreed, a slow, disbelieving smile breaking across her face. She looked down at Copper, patting his sweaty, dust-coated neck. "He's a good boy." They worked together to lasso the stuck calf and use Arthur's horse to drag it to safety. By the time they rode back to the farmhouse, the sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple. That night, after Clara had scrubbed the mud from Lily in a lukewarm bath, she sat on the edge of the twins' bed, brushing the tangles from Lily's damp hair. Lily was quiet, staring at the quilt covering her knees. "I was really scared today," she whispered. "I know, little bird. Mud like that is dangerous. You have to respect the land. It doesn't care if you have good intentions." Clara set the brush down. Lily looked up, her brown eyes solemn and heavy with exhaustion. "When I was stuck, I thought you weren't going to be able to reach me because you were on the horse. Dad said you didn't like horses anymore." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She smoothed a hand over Lily's cheek. "Some things are scarier than horses, Lily. Watching you fall was one of them. I wasn't going to let you go." Lily leaned forward, wrapping her small arms tightly around Clara's neck. She buried her face in Clara's shoulder, her breathing slowing as sleep finally overtook her. "Thank you, Mom," Lily mumbled softly against Clara's collarbone. Clara froze. The word hung in the quiet, dim room, heavier than gold. Maisie, asleep in the next bed, shifted slightly. Clara closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around the little girl, resting her chin on top of her head. "You're welcome, my sweet girl," Clara whispered to the sleeping child. "You're welcome." August brought no relief, only a brittle, terrifying dryness. The prairie was a tinderbox, the grass so dry it shattered to dust under the heel of a boot. Every rancher in the valley slept with one eye open, the scent of smoke a constant phantom anxiety in their minds. The heat broke on the 14th of August, not with rain, but with a violent atmospheric pressure change that brought the sky crashing down in an angry, bruised purple. The air smelled sharp with ozone. Arthur and Clara sat on the front porch after dinner. The girls were inside reading by the light of a battery-powered lantern, as the power had flickered out an hour prior. The silence between the couple wasn't the comfortable silence they had grown accustomed to. It was thick and heavy. Clara had been quiet all day. She had worked with a mechanical, punishing intensity, cleaning out the loft of the barn, organizing feed sacks until her hands bled. She hadn't looked Arthur in the eye since breakfast. Arthur sat in the rocking chair, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, watching the horizon. He knew what day it was. He had seen the small, faded calendar in her toolbox, the date circled in a heavy black marker 3 years ago, a circle that had been retraced so many times the paper had nearly worn through. A jagged fork of dry lightning split the sky over the distant northern ridge, illuminating the heavy clouds in a flash of stark, blinding white. A few seconds later, the thunder rolled over the valley, a deep, percussive boom that rattled the floorboards of the porch. "That struck close to Elias Thorne's property," Arthur noted quietly, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for the telltale glow of fire. "No rain behind it." "Just sparks," Clara murmured. She was sitting on the top step, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She stared out into the dark. Arthur set his glass down. He stood up, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and walked over to sit on the step beside her. Their shoulders brushed. He didn't push. He just offered his presence, a solid, immovable anchor in the gathering storm. "He was 24, Clara said suddenly. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual grit. It sounded incredibly fragile. Arthur didn't interrupt. He turned his head, watching her profile illuminated by another distant flash of lightning. "John," Clara continued, staring straight ahead. "He was 24. We had a little 50-acre plot down in Colorado. Nothing but scrub brush and rocks, but he thought he could turn it into Eden. He was so loud, always laughing, always moving." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her knees. "It's been 3 years today, and I realized something this afternoon while I was sweeping the loft." She finally turned to look at Arthur. Her gray eyes were wide, swimming with unshed tears, reflecting the lightning storms on the horizon. "I realized I can't remember the exact sound of his laugh anymore," Clara whispered, a tear breaking free and cutting a track through the dust on her cheek. "I tried for an hour. I sat there in the hay and I tried to hear it in my head, and I couldn't. It's fading. He's fading. And it makes me feel like the most terrible, disloyal person in the world." The confession hung in the humid air, raw and bleeding. Arthur reached out, his large hand gently enveloping her tightly clasped hands. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it was okay to forget. He was a widower. He knew the unique, suffocating guilt of moving on. "When Sarah died," Arthur began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It was an aneurysm, fast, no warning. She was making pancakes, turned around to hand Lily a plate, dropped it, and was gone before she hit the floor. Clara unlaced her fingers, turning her hand over to grip his tightly. For the first year, Arthur continued, staring out at the dark pasture, I kept her perfume on the dresser. Every morning I'd spray a little in the air just to smell her, to prove she was real. Then one day the bottle was empty. I drove to 3 different towns trying to find that exact scent, and they had discontinued it. He looked at Clara, his dark eyes deeply compassionate. I sat in my truck in a pharmacy parking lot and cried until I threw up. I thought losing her smell meant I was losing her. But you weren't, Clara whispered. No, Arthur agreed. I wasn't. The memories just changed shape. They stopped being things I could see and hear, and became things I just carried, like a scar. It doesn't hurt to touch anymore, but you always know it's there. Arthur shifted on the step, turning to face her fully. He reached up, wiping the tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. You aren't disloyal, Clara. You lived. You survived a terrible thing and your heart kept beating. John wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life chained to the memory of a ghost. He loved you. He'd want you to breathe. I am happy here, Arthur, Clara said, her voice shaking with the weight of the admission. I love the girls. I love this land. I love you. And it terrified me today, because feeling this happy felt like I was closing the door on him forever. You don't have to close the door, Arthur said fiercely. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around her. You bring him with you. You bring his memory, and I'll bring Sarah's, and we'll carry them together. But this is for the living. Clara buried her face in his shoulder, gripping the fabric of his shirt, as she finally let out the sobs she had been holding back for 3 years. She cried for the boy who died too young, for the years of lonely highways, for the bitter cold nights in the truck. And as she cried, Arthur held her tight, a bastion of strength against the dark, absorbing her grief until there was nothing left but a profound, exhausting peace. Another massive strike of lightning hit the northern ridge, closer this time. A sharp, terrifying crack of thunder followed instantly. Arthur pulled back, looking up at the ridge. A small, orange glow began to bloom against the black silhouette of the pine trees. Fire, Arthur said, his tone instantly shifting from husband to rancher. Lightning struck a dead stand of timber. Clara wiped her eyes, her sorrow instantly replaced by adrenaline. She stood up, looking at the glowing orange spot. The wind was picking up, pushing the flames down the ridge toward Elias Thorne's property. But if the wind shifted, it would sweep through the dry valley straight for the Hayes Ranch. I'll wake the girls and pack the truck just in case, Clara said, her voice steady and clear. You get the UTV and the chainsaws. We need to head up there and help Thorne cut a fire break before it reaches the dry grass in the basin. You stay here, Arthur said, already moving toward the barn. It's too dangerous. We are partners, Arthur, Clara shouted over the rising wind, leaving no room for argument. I can run a chainsaw as well as you. You carry the sky, I carry the iron. Remember? Arthur stopped, looking back at her. The glow of the distant fire reflected in his eyes. He saw the fierce, unyielding woman he had married, the woman who had just emptied her heart of its ghosts and was now ready to fight for the home they had built. He gave a sharp nod. Load the truck, 5 minutes. They spent the entire night on the northern ridge, working shoulder to shoulder with Elias Thorne and a dozen other neighboring ranchers. They felled trees in the dark, choking on thick, acrid smoke, their faces blackened with soot. Clara ran a heavy steel chainsaw until her arms went numb, cutting brush to starve the approaching flames, while Arthur drove a bulldozer, scraping the earth down to the mineral soil to create a fire break. By dawn, the wind died down, and a light, misty rain finally began to fall, extinguishing the remaining embers. Clara and Arthur sat on the tailgate of Thorne's pickup truck, drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos. They were exhausted, filthy, and smelling heavily of smoke. Arthur looked at Clara, her face smeared with black soot, her hair a tangled mess, a burn hole in the sleeve of her jacket. She caught him looking, and offered a tired, crooked smile. Arthur reached out, lacing his soot-stained fingers with hers. They had fought off the ghosts of the past, and they had fought off the fire of the present. As the sun rose over the blackened ridge, illuminating the untouched green expanse of their valley below, Clara rested her head on Arthur's shoulder. She didn't need to hear John's laugh anymore. The steady, strong beating of Arthur's heart against her cheek was all the sound she needed. October arrived, bringing with it a sharp, biting crispness that turned the aspens on the mountainsides to brilliant, burning gold. The brutal heat of the summer was a memory, and the ranch settled into the frantic, purposeful rhythm of the fall harvest. It was shipping day, the culmination of a year's worth of blood, sweat, and frozen fingers. The heavy diesel engines of 3 massive semi-trucks idled in the dirt yard, the air thick with exhaust and the bawling of the yearling calves. The corral was a whirlwind of dust and motion. Arthur, on his bay gelding, and Clara, atop Copper, worked with a seamless telepathic synchronicity, cutting the calves from the herd and driving them up the wooden loading chute into the aluminum trailers. "Hiya! Move 'em up!" Clara shouted, waving her hat, urging the last stubborn steer up the ramp. The heavy metal door of the trailer slammed shut with a resounding clang, dropping the metal latch securely into place. The truck driver, a burly man in a denim jacket, gave Arthur a thumbs up and climbed into the cab. Clara rode Copper over to the fence, dismounting with the fluid grace she hadn't possessed a year ago. She tied him to the rail and slapped the dust from her jeans. Arthur rode up beside her, dismounting and dropping his horse's reins. Elias Thorne, leaning heavily on his cane, stood by the hood of Arthur's pickup truck. He was the buyer this year, acting as a broker for a large feedlot in Nebraska. He had a leather checkbook resting on the hood. "Good-looking calves, Arthur," Elias said, writing out the numbers with a slow, deliberate hand. "Heavy. That south pasture grass did them good through the drought." "We watered them well," Arthur replied, his eyes flickering toward Clara. Elias tore the check from the ledger and handed it to Arthur. "Prices are up this fall. This should keep the bank off your back for a good long while." Arthur looked down at the slip of paper. It wasn't just a check. It was security. It was a guarantee that the roof over their heads would stay theirs, that the wood stove would burn hot through the winter, and that the girls would have new coats. He folded the check carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. "Appreciate it, Elias," Arthur said, shaking the older man's hand. Elias tipped his hat to Clara. "You're a good hand, Mrs. Hayes. Arthur's a lucky man." "I think we got lucky with each other, Mr. Thorne," Clara smiled, leaning against the wooden fence. They watched the semi-trucks rumble out of the driveway, the heavy tires kicking up clouds of golden dust that caught the afternoon light. The silence that fell over the ranch wasn't the heavy, desolate silence of the previous year. It was the satisfied, bone-deep quiet of a job well done. "We did it," Arthur murmured, stepping up behind Clara and wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "We did," Clara agreed, leaning back against his chest. "We're safe for the winter." The low rumble of the yellow school bus turning off the county road broke the quiet. It ground to a halt at the end of the driveway, its red lights flashing. The doors opened, and Maisie and Lily spilled out, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders as they sprinted up the long dirt road toward the house. "Dad! Mom!" Lily yelled, waving a piece of paper in her hand. Clara's heart swelled. Hearing that word, Mom, still sent a thrill of absolute wonder through her veins. She stepped out of Arthur's arms and walked to meet them, crouching down as the girls collided with her in a tangle of limbs and giggles. "Careful, I'm covered in dust," Clara laughed, hugging them tightly. "Look what I made in art class," Lily said proudly, thrusting the slightly crumpled piece of construction paper into Clara's hands. Clara stood up, unfolding the paper. Arthur stepped up beside her to look. It was a crayon drawing, rendered in the chaotic, vibrant style of an 8-year-old. It depicted the farmhouse, a brown dog that was unmistakably Barnaby, and 4 stick figures standing in a line holding hands. The tallest figure had a black cowboy hat. Next to him were 2 smaller figures with pigtails, and on the end, Holding the smallest figure's hand was a woman with a gray crayon scribble for a wrench in her hand. Across the top, in large, uneven letters, Lily had written, "My family." Clara stared at the drawing. A year ago, she had been a widow living in a freezing truck, terrified of attachments, convinced that her capacity for love had been buried in a grave in Colorado. Now she was holding a masterpiece that declared she belonged. She swallowed the lump in her throat and looked down at Lily. "It's beautiful, little bird. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. We're going to frame this and put it right above the kitchen table." "Really?" Lily beamed. "Absolutely," Arthur agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He ruffled Maisie's hair. "Now, go wash up. Your mom and I need to put the horses away, and then we're making a big dinner to celebrate shipping day." The girls ran toward the house, Barnaby hobbling off the porch to greet them with a happy bark. Arthur took Clara's hand, his thumb brushing over her gold wedding band. They turned to walk the horses back to the barn. As they passed the edge of the driveway, Clara paused. The rusted cab of the 1984 Ford sat quietly in the autumn sun. The black-eyed Susans they had planted in the engine bay on their wedding day had bloomed brilliantly over the summer, a riot of yellow and black against the oxidized steel. Now, with the frost approaching, the flowers had gone to seed, the petals drying and falling away to leave the dark, heavy heads behind. It wasn't an ending. Clara, who knew the cycles of the earth as well as she knew the cycles of an engine, understood what she was looking at. The dry seed heads would fall into the dark topsoil over the winter. They would sleep beneath the heavy snows, insulated and safe. And when the spring thaw came again, they would sprout, thicker and stronger than before. Arthur followed her gaze. He squeezed her hand. "Looks like they're ready for winter," he said softly. "They are," Clara smiled, looking away from the old truck and up into the eyes of her husband. "We all are." They walked into the dim, quiet sanctuary of the barn, unsaddled the horses, and walked back toward the farmhouse. The kitchen windows glowed with warm, golden light against the approaching twilight. Inside, a fire burned in the stove, and two little girls were waiting for them. The Wyoming winter was coming with its brutal winds and deep snows, but for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel the cold. She was finally truly home.
This story is not simply about a broken truck, a struggling ranch, or a chance encounter in a cold valley. At its heart, it is a story about what happens when people who have been quietly shattered by life are given one more chance, not to survive, but to belong. Clara arrives as a woman defined by loss. She has learned to live without hope, without attachment, and without the expectation that anything good will last. Her strength is undeniable, but it is a lonely strength, the kind built from necessity, not from love. Arthur, in many ways, mirrors her. He is a man who has not stopped breathing, but has stopped living. He carries responsibility, grief, and silence like armor, believing that isolation is the only way to protect what remains of his family. The first meaning of this story lies in the idea that survival is not the same as living. Both Clara and Arthur have mastered survival. They work, endure, and push forward. But it is only when they begin to open themselves, reluctantly, painfully, to one another and to the children, that life slowly returns. The story reminds us that human beings are not meant to carry everything alone. Strength without connection becomes emptiness. Another powerful lesson comes through Clara's transformation. She believes she must leave once her job is done because she sees herself as temporary, as someone who does not belong anywhere. This reflects a deep truth about trauma. People who have lost everything often believe they are not allowed to have something again. Yet the story gently challenges this belief. Through her actions, protecting the children, repairing what is broken, standing beside Arthur in moments of crisis, Clara proves that belonging is not something granted, it is something built. The relationship between Clara and the two girls carries another emotional layer. At first, Clara rejects the idea of being a mother. She defines herself by what she is not. But love in this story does not arrive through declarations. It grows through responsibility, presence, and small acts of care. By the time Lily calls her mom, it is not a title given lightly, it is something earned through sacrifice and choice. This teaches us that family is not always about blood. It is about who stays, who protects, and who chooses to love, despite fear. Arthur's journey is equally meaningful. His greatest struggle is not the land, the debt, or the storms. It is learning to trust again. When he defends Clara, when he asks her to stay, when he admits that he needs her, he is breaking down walls that grief had built. The story shows that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, it is the doorway to healing. Without it, love cannot grow. The recurring hardships, the blizzard, the lost child, the financial crisis, the wildfire, are not just external conflicts. They represent life itself, unpredictable, harsh, and often unfair. Yet each challenge pushes the characters closer together instead of tearing them apart. This is where the deeper moral emerges. True resilience is not about avoiding hardship, but about facing it together. One of the most symbolic elements in the story is the old truck. At first, it represents Clara's past, broken, worn, and tied to loss. But by the end, it is transformed into something new, a place where flowers grow. This transformation carries a powerful message. The past does not need to be erased to create a future. It can be reshaped, repurposed, and turned into something meaningful. Pain, when faced with courage and love, can become the foundation for something beautiful. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is about letting go, not of memories, but of guilt. Clara struggles with the fear that moving forward means betraying her past. Arthur understands this deeply, and through him, the story offers a quiet truth. We do not honor the people we lost by staying broken. We honor them by continuing to live, to love, and to build something new. In the end, this story teaches us that home is not a place we find, it is something we create with others. It is built through trust, through shared hardship, and through the courage to stay when leaving would be easier. And maybe that is the greatest meaning of all. Sometimes, the life we thought was over is only waiting for the right moment and the right people to begin again.